go back to the studies that have been done and to ask you what studies have most perhaps shocked you or surprised you or have stuck with you. And just for purposes of, I suppose, sharing on my side, the studies are really wide-ranging. I mean, many studies had been performed in the, I suppose, well, I'm not sure when the early 50s and early 60s, but even looking at the more recent studies related to smoking cessation or different forms of addiction, certainly end-of-life anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, there are a number of characteristics that have been really surprising to me when looking at the results. But I'd be curious to hear if there are any related to the magnitude, persistence, or anything of effects that have been particularly memorable for you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first one that was really memorable to me was the first one I read, and this was a 2006 study done at Johns Hopkins in the lab of Roland Griffiths, who I believe you know pretty well.
I do.
And this was a kind of wild study because it didn't purport to have any practical utility at all. It wasn't. It had nothing to do with health or healing people. It was really an attempt to see if psilocybin could be used to occasion, that's the verb they use, to occasion profound mystical experiences in people. And the title of this paper is kind of hilarious. High dose of psilocybin can occasion profound mystical experiences in people that have lasting value or something like that. I don't have it quite right, but it just stood out as, wait, scientists do this? That's pretty cool. And what's a mystical experience doing in a scientific experiment? But in a way, this was the predicate of all the research to come in this renaissance that's going on, because they had proven that you could safely administer these drugs in this environment, and that with a very high percentage, you could induce this kind of experience that people would report as one of the two or three most meaningful experiences in their lives, comparable to the birth of a child or the death of a parent. The fact that you could induce such an experience in a laboratory reliably with a mushroom, that kind of blew my mind. And I interviewed many people in that trial, and it was really interesting to hear their experience. These are so-called healthy normals, so they didn't have a pathology, they weren't dying, and they were kind of spiritually inclined. That was definitely, it seemed to me a common denominator of the volunteers, but that this drug would create an experience that was indistinguishable from mystical experiences as we have them in the literature, as they were recorded by the great mystics of all time, and all the writers who've talked about mystical experience, from Whitman to Emerson to Tennyson. So I thought that was a really cool study, and the testimony of the people in it was very interesting. It was also interesting that in a follow-up, they crunched that data very carefully, and they discovered that statistically significant percentage of people who had these psilocybin experiences had actually had changes in their personality that were enduring. Psychologists divide personality up into 5 traits, and I'm not going to remember them all, but it's things like conscientiousness, neuroticism, extroversion, openness, and I forget the 5th. But openness, which correlates with tolerance for other people's points of view, ability to take in lots of surprising information, creativity, actually was increased, statistically significant increase in openness. And it's very rare that personality changes in adults at all. And the idea that a mushroom could induce such a change was really striking. Now, this has yet to be reproduced, this particular result, but whether there are lasting changes in personality of people who take psychedelics, I think is a really rich topic to explore, and definitely deserves more work. The smoking study you alluded to, I thought was also fascinating. Here you have one of the hardest of all habits to kick. 80% of people who went through this process, which involved 2 or 3 psychedelic trips on psilocybin and some cognitive behavioral therapy in between, 80% were confirmed abstinent, were not smoking at the 6-month mark, and that number fell to I think it was 67% after a year. This is a small pilot study, open label, which means everybody knew they were getting psilocybin. Nobody got a placebo. But that's pretty impressive. And in fact, 67% success after a year is better than anything else that's out there. So this study needs to be reproduced.
Yeah, and it's not
happening.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but also, as I understand it, it's not a marginal difference in efficacy compared to the sort of standard of care if we're looking at alternative treatments. I mean, the delta, at least with this preliminary study, as you mentioned, open label, is something. I mean, I somebody out there on the internet can certainly correct me, but I want to say it was perhaps the alternative sort of option B, more traditionally speaking, would be somewhere in the 20s in terms of efficacy at the 6-month mark, looking at abstinence rates. I could be getting that wrong.
I think that there's a drug people use called Chantix that I've seen advertised on television. I think that does a little better than that 20% mark, but the patch is not that successful, and so it's a big deal. But what was also noteworthy to me about that particular study was talking to the people in the study, and I would ask them, so why did this make it any easier to quit smoking? I mean, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with smoking. And they would describe an experience that put their life and their behavior in such a radically new context. And they would say that, they would say these incredibly banal things. They'd say, like, I realized my breath is precious and that there's no life without breath. And it's really stupid to damage your breath. And I'm like, duh. Didn't you know that already? And they did know it in an intellectual way, but I think one of the real hallmarks of psychedelic experience is that things you think you know, but really only exists on the very top of consciousness, suddenly set down roots deep in your subconscious, and they become these, convictions, absolute rock solid convictions that you believe in a way you've never believed anything before. And that, I think, allows people to kind of, put flesh on some platitude like smoking is bad for you, and killing yourself is stupid. Suddenly you feel it at a much deeper level. And so I was struck by that. And in fact, Matt Johnson, who is the psychologist at Hopkins who directed this study, he calls them duh moments. That people have a lot of duh moments, but they're transformative. And that is that, if you've ever had a psychedelic experience, there is that weird bleeding from banality into profundity and back again that happens, and that definitely seems to go on. So one of the ways, one of the psychological mechanisms that may be at work is this ability to reinforce an idea that we all already know or we should know better, and make it powerful enough to actually guide our behavior.
What are some of the potential applications or current